Thanks for the opportunity to join you here, and greetings from New Zealand, where it's very late in the evening. So let's talk a little bit about how we try and get aviation moving again. And so here's aptly a picture of an aeroplane which is on the ground, as most of them are. Two things really are the challenges before us, and that's how do we manage the risk of transmission of the virus in flight. And we'll talk about that first because I think the news is pretty encouraging in that regard. And the second challenge is how to manage the risk of importing cases of the virus across national borders. And that brings questions of quarantine and testing, which are indeed challenging. But firstly, regarding transmission, there are a number of things about the cabin environment which really do reduce the risk of transmission. People sit facing the same way. They don't have much face-to-face interaction. There are these high seat backs which form a physical barrier. And the airflow is very controlled, mostly from top to bottom, and very little movement forwards and backwards along the cabin at a very high airflow rate, and any recirculated air is effectively filtered through HEPA filters. So you will be aware that we've taken a lot of extra steps as well this year to achieve physical distancing in the airport, contactless processes right through the travel journey, and measures on board as well to minimize people moving around and having contact with each other. And these have been in place all over the world. But I'd like to refer to some work that was done and released just a couple of weeks ago by three of the manufacturers of aircraft. So Boeing, Embraer, and Airbus had a joint press conference with IATA. A lot of their work has been to do with modeling using computational fluid dynamics, how aerosol particles in particular will move inside the cabin. And they've tested a number of scenarios, and there's also real live testing with actual aircraft cabins as well. So if we look first at what Boeing presented at that conference, they used their fluid dynamic modeling of motion of aerosol in the cabin and a series of very elegant calculations, which really showed that because of those airflow characteristics, being on an aircraft next to somebody else is roughly the equivalent of being in a normal indoor environment 7 feet away from the same person. That's assuming you have a mask on board the aircraft. So they said that based on the particle count, 7 feet is equivalent to 1 feet on the aircraft. Similarly, Embraer did modeling of how much a cough from one individual would have diminished in volume by the time it reaches somebody else nearby them, and the proportion of the aerosol particles that reach their neighbor is very, very low without a mask, but even lower with a mask there. So it's a 50th%, which again is reassuring. And then finally, Airbus did, by a completely different method, the same sort of analysis as Boeing, and a very similar conclusion. So at 6 feet off the aircraft, you're equivalent to being next to somebody on the aircraft with everybody masked. So how has that translated to what we've actually seen? We've reviewed all of the published research on in-flight transmission cases this year. And this is a summary. It's a busy slide, I'm sorry, but what you see there down at the bottom is from all of these flights where it's suspected or known that some transmission has occurred on board, there are 41 secondary cases in total. That's from about 157 primary cases on board and a total passenger number of 5,600. So of the total passengers on those flights, it's 0.75%. Of course, during that time, the actual total number of passengers that have flown is huge. It's 1.2 billion. But that, of course, has to be said that we will have only confirmed a small percentage of those transmissions. However, even if it was 100 times that, the total number is very, very small. So that's two pieces of reassuring information, but perhaps the best came up just a week or two ago, and this is a big study done in the US with the Defense Research Agency using mannequins on board actual aircraft. And they had the mannequins breathing or coughing. So they were releasing tracer particles of aerosol. And they had large numbers of detectors around the cabin to receive how much aerosol would reach passengers in those locations. Some of it was also DNA tagged so they could look at surfaces. They used different aircraft and looked at both on the ground and in flight, and saw again that there was rapid dilution by the high airflow rates and air exchanges, and the detectable particles were only up to about 6 minutes, compared with typically 90 minutes in an indoor environment. So this again reflects the way that the cabin has been designed. So from that they derived that with typical shedding rates and infectious doses, it would probably require something like 54 hours to produce an in-flight infection in normal circumstances. So the events that we've seen in flight do appear to be rare, and there's reason for that. The overhead nozzles don't seem to make much difference, and also which seat you're in doesn't make a huge difference to that overall risk. So that's the easier side, as I said, of the equation, which is the risk of transmission in flight. The much greater problem for us is how do countries manage their concerns about people being entering the country when they're incubating and therefore importing the virus to their shores. And so we've seen all of these very restrictive border controls in most countries around the world, which of course are having devastating effects on economies and on jobs, and thereby on health of many people. And you see there an estimate of about 200 million jobs to be lost in the travel and tourism sector this year. So what has been proposed through IATA and also through multi-country and multi-party organisations, including ICAO, is a risk-based approach to the quarantine measures. So what is the risk at the country where the passengers are leaving and where they're arriving? And looking at that in terms of the rate of new infections per capita and the trend in that infection rate, is it going up or down? And finally, what's the state of the public health response to the outbreak in those countries? And there are various measures that we can look at for that. So if the travellers are going from a low prevalence to a higher prevalence, then there really doesn't seem to be much rationale for any quarantine measures there, because the arriving traveller presents a lower risk than the community around them in that destination. If the two countries have similar risk levels or prevalence levels, and we get a negative test in association with travel, then on average, the risk of those travellers is lower than either community, the one they are leaving or the one they're going to, which leaves the challenging problem of the high to low prevalence travel. So can we relax somewhat the quarantine measures by use of testing in that environment? And a lot of work has been going into this. So when it comes to testing for COVID-19, the considerations include the efficacy or the effectiveness of the test. Sensitivity and specificity are the two general measures there. How quickly can it be performed, especially in large numbers, if that's going to be required at an airport? Can we do it on just saliva so that we don't have to be using nasal swabs? And what's the price? So the gold standard, as we all know, is the PCR test on a nasopharyngeal swab. It's highly sensitive if the person is infectious at the time. But in many countries, it's slow. And even at best, it's going to be hours to get the result. Slightly faster is a thing called RT-LAMP, which is also called isothermal PCR. And that's improving in terms of availability and performance. But the other growing area is the antigen tests, most of which are now very portable, just like a little pregnancy test kit. And the swab can go on that and produce a result within minutes. It's less sensitive and less specific than the PCR, but it's constantly improving. And there are other tests on the horizon, including spectroscopy, which can even potentially be done with breath or with a gargle. And there are some reports of other tests which may be effective even during the incubation period before somebody's actually contagious, which would be a real game changer for us. So this really represents some of those features of the various tests, which I won't go through in detail. The RT-LAMP is a variant of the PCR, which uses a technique to accelerate the process somewhat. Antigen tests use a reaction to the coating around the virus rather than the genetic material itself, whereas PCR is reacting to the genetic material. And there are some challenges about when to test, and you've probably already seen that there are a raft of different approaches being adopted around the world. Should you do it on arrival? And we've seen some examples of that creates great uncertainty for the arriving traveller and the risk of having to be isolated in the new country with the travel companions. Should it be at the departure airport? Again, this is challenging in an airport environment, the time, the space, and managing anybody who tests positive. The risk is of a last-minute cancellation again. Or do you do it prior to departure? This is convenient, but it allows a window during which you can be infected even after being tested. It also creates some problems about how does the arrival country verify that the test was the right one on the right person and that it wasn't fraudulent. So in summary, in-flight transmission risk appears to be low overall based on computational fluid dynamics modelling, on case reports, both published and unpublished, and on the recent TRANSCOM DARPA study. But the risk is not zero, and we do need to continue to be cautious. There are these exceptions, and you might have seen on that slide that half of those cases were actually from two apparent super spreader type events. So the rare exceptions continue to be important. Secondly, controlling the risk of importation poses many challenges, but we feel that a risk-based approach has the potential to avoid quarantine in many situations, and that testing can facilitate this whole process. And most certainly the testing technologies are rapidly developing, but again, there are important implementation challenges such as preventing fraud. So if you're one of the few that's going to be flying, what can you do? We've just listed a few tips here. The most important one is the first one: don't fly if you're unwell. But there's a few things that you can do to give yourself the equipment that you need, the time that you need, the space that you need, and keep your mask on. So that's my piece. Thank you very much.